All right, so Bloomberg just put out an article basically chronicling the downfall of Suicide Squad killed the Justice League, and it's pretty fascinating. So let's get into some bits that I cut out to talk about. So we'll start here. At its gaming studio in Montreal, Warner Brothers. So this is Warner Brothers Montreal. These are the guys that made Batman Arkham Origins. Already had a Suicide Squad video game that was struggling to gel. The studio's co-founders, Jamie Walker and Sefton Hill, eager to do something different, started working on a prototype of an original multiplayer puzzle-solving game codenamed Stones. By the way, when it says the studio's co-founders, they're talking about Rocksteady, the guys that made the original Batman Arkham games, as well as Suicide Squad. At the time, the broader industry was growing increasingly fixated on games as a service. Armed with a battery of presentations, Warner Brothers executives traveled to London and made the case that the growing category was the industry's future. Rocksteady executives soon decided that, in keeping with their parent company's newfound enthusiasm, Suicide Squad would become an online multiplayer game with live service content. So that is a very interesting clarification there. I've been kind of assuming, a lot of us have been kind of assuming that, it was the case that that Warner Brothers came in, the executives flopped their massive penises on the desk and they were like, Rocksteady, you're making a live service game. And to a certain extent that did happen, but it should just be noted that the co-founders of the studio were already planning on doing a live service game themselves. It's not like they were interested in making another single player game. And then, at that point, the Warner Brothers executives came in, flopped their massive penises on the table, and were like, you're making a live service game. No, they were already going to do that. So that's not great to hear, if I'm being completely honest. Let's get back to the article. And also that's also interesting. Well, we already kind of figured that Warner Brothers Montreal was working on a Suicide Squad game because that was actually teased. If you remember, there was a post-credit scene in Batman Arkham Origins where like Amanda Waller goes to Deathstroke and they were like, Deathstroke, you can work for me or die in prison or something. So presumably Warner Brothers Montreal was working on a Suicide Squad game that would have featured Deathstroke. But that obviously never happened. All right. Where were we? Oh, but and then I'll also mention this is that this was around would have been around 2016, right? So this was like prime time of the industry being like, live service is the future. We have to make live service games. Look how much money all these live service games are making. And it's fascinating to see how long games take to make, where like they obviously must have realized that this was a mistake, but it's like watching a car crash in slow motion where you're like, man, we really screwed the pooch here, right? Around like 2020. But you can't stop making the game now. You can't pivot to something else. It's like you actively know that you made a mistake, but you just have to trudge forward for like 2 more years. That's depressing to think about, man. Okay, let's continue reading. Rocksteady executives soon decided that, in keeping with their parent company's newfound enthusiasm, Suicide Squad would become an online multiplayer game with live service content. Over the next 7 years, it would swell from roughly 160 to more than 250 people, a size that grew unwieldy for managers, yet still remained far smaller than the enormous teams behind similar games, such as Destiny. Actually, let me come back here. So it says that, in keeping with their parent company's enthusiasm, or newfound enthusiasms. It's not entirely clear, but I wonder if it is the case that if Rocksteady executives really wanted to, right? Like if Jamie Walker and Sefton Hill really wanted to, I wonder if they could have done a single player game. And if at the end of the day, they really did just want to make a live service game. This kind of seems to indicate that. But it's also one of those things where it's like, oh, well, the executives they weren't forcing them to make the live service game. They were just heavily encouraging them. So, it could be it's I guess what I'm saying here is that it does not seem to be like, it just doesn't seem to be the case that it is as black and white as Warner Brothers forced Rocksteady to make a live service game. It does seem to be the case that, at least to some extent, Rocksteady made the mistake themselves. You know what I mean? All right. During the early days, the studio kept its work on Suicide Squad a secret. Several people who came on board during this era said they were surprised when they first arrived at the offices to learn that they would be working on a multiplayer game. Many would depart as a result. So that's crazy, right? Like, the size of the team ballooned from 160 to 250 people. If you're Sefton Hill and Jamie Walker, whatever their names were, like, that's already way more people than you're used to managing. But even then, when it comes to making a live service game, other studios apparently have way more people working on it. So it's like you're simultaneously managing way more people than you're used to, but you're also understaffed when it comes to making live service games. It really does just seem like just a bad situation all around. And like, you're lying to people, apparently. You're not telling them that they're being hired to make a live service game. They're going in there thinking that they're going to be making, like, the next, single player DC game. That's crazy. That's just a weird tactic. Many would depart as a result. Over time, the leader's vision kept morphing, most notably switching from an emphasis on melee combat to heavily focusing on guns. The change left some staff members wondering why protagonists, such as Captain Boomerang, known for fighting with his namesake weapon, would suddenly pivot to gunplay. So, I mean, that's very interesting, right? The article details that apparently, like, or at least this is what the article heavily indicates. The article heavily indicates that a lot of this stuff, like, employees were complaining to the co-founders, Sefton Hill and Jamie Walker. His name is Jamie Walker, right? Hold on. Yeah, Jamie Walker. Like, employees were complaining to them. They were telling them, like, hey, I don't know about this when it comes to stuff like the gameplay and stuff like, having these characters be gun focused when that doesn't really make sense for who they are. And apparently it just is the case that this is what Jamie Walker and Sefton Hill wanted to do. And that's really the message that I want to get across here. A lot of people are of the opinion that, Warner Brothers came in and they forced, and by the way, this was me as well, they forced Rocksteady to make this game. That's just not true. It just isn't true. Rocksteady, the people that made the Batman Arkham games, they made a bad game, right? The co-founders made this game. The guys that wrote the Batman Arkham games, they wrote Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. I'm not saying that you have to like Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. What I am saying is that it's just unfair to act like the people that are there now just made this bad game, because that's simply not true. We can't just hold Rocksteady as like, the old Rocksteady. They were such an incredible team, which they were. I'm not saying they weren't. They were such an incredible team, and they had the studio taken away from them, and these new people came in and made Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League. That's simply not what happened. Anyways, we'll keep going. But additional frustrations kept piling up. The project's massive world and 4 playable heroes were a significant increase in complexity from the Arkham games. Engineers prioritized short-term fixes that later proved to be hindrances as the release date kept getting pushed back. So, I mean, it really does there's just more of, hey, we don't know how to make a live service game. And it seems like they just did a bunch of stuff that ultimately made things incredibly difficult. Staff members sometimes waited weeks or months for Hill, the studio's perfectionist co-founder and director of the game, to review their work, creating a bottleneck that further slowed development. He scrapped big chunks of the script and struggled to convey his evolving ideas, they said, confessing that he hadn't spent much time with competing games such as Destiny. So this is weird. This is like one of those things that I've heard about, is that oftentimes like studios like BioWare, when they transitioned from making like Mass Effect to Anthem, or like Crystal Dynamics, who transitioned from making like the Tomb Raider games to Marvel's Avengers, when they transition to making live service games, they kind of go into it with the mentality of, Pasha, we are Rocksteady. We don't need to pay attention to Destiny. We don't need to pay attention to Fortnite. We don't need to pay attention to the successful live service games. We are Rocksteady. We will simply make an incredible game. But what we're learning about from this article is just that, what they talk about Sefton Hill being a perfectionist and all of that. All of that's fine, or it could be fine if you're making like a single player game and it's smaller in scope and whatnot, and you're dealing with less people. But when you're broadening the scope of your game, when you're making a live service game, this like incredibly perfectionist and slow work culture, I guess. It just doesn't seem to be conducive for the game that they were making. And apparently like he's just like making changes all the time, that he was making changes to the story and stuff all the time. And apparently he was having trouble conveying, those ideas to the studio. And it honestly does seem to be that like just this bigger staff pool of staff that he now had, it seems like he just didn't have enough time to like individually grapple with each team in a timely manner. It's just having a studio that doesn't know how to make these kinds of games. Like you put them to make that kind of game, and it's just not going to work out. Multiple people who worked on the project say their growing concerns were often met with promises from management that Suicide Squad would eventually coalesce at the last minute, just as the Arkham games had. Several employees adopted the term toxic positivity to describe the culture of the company, which discouraged criticism. Despite the internal concerns among frontline workers, executives from Warner Brothers kept reviewing demonstrations of the game and sending laudatory feedback, praising the graphics, and saying they expected Suicide Squad to become a billion-dollar franchise. I mean, like, I've also heard about just this this shared delusion, or folie à deux. By the way, that's what folie à deux means, shared delusion. I felt like I needed to explain that. But like, I've heard about this from BioWare and Anthem, where they would use when they were making Anthem, they would like talk about how the BioWare magic is going to salvage the project in the end. Don't worry, guys, it's all gonna turn out great at the end of the day. No, if you have problems, you gotta fix them, bro. And then obviously you have like Warner Brothers executives who have absolutely no idea what video games are. They're like, you guys are doing great, guys. That sure does look pretty, don't it? Wow, this is gonna make so much money. Oh, you're telling me you have like loot boxes and storefronts where we can charge people money after they pay for the game? We could just charge them more money? Great, awesome. Like, that's all they know or care about. In the fall of 2022, Warner Brothers announced that Hill and Walker were leaving Rocksteady to work on a new adventure, and that a pair of longtime employees, Nathan Burlow and Darius Sadgian, were being promoted in their wake. It's one of those things where I don't want to necessarily paint these guys as like villains or anything like that, because like at the end of the day, like, they made a bad video game, and it is what it is, But like, it does, and we don't know like exactly what went down, just to be clear, but it really does just come off as like kind of shitty that, according to the employees, right, that contributed to this Bloomberg article, that you guys, while yes, you were thrust into making a game that you didn't know how to make, you went into it wanting to make a live service game. That was what you were going to pivot to either way. And so you have that whole situation there. Or sorry, at the very least, the article says that they were going to make a multiplayer game. Maybe it wouldn't have been live service necessarily. Yeah, sorry, I just double checked. It was an original multiplayer game. So just actually, sorry, just to be fair, it could have been, something like what's that game called? Oh gosh, the one where you play as like toys or something. I'm forgetting the name of it. It Takes Two. That's the game that I'm thinking about. It could have been something like that, which, to be fair, is not a live service game. But still, like you went into Suicide Squad wanting to pivot away from the type of game that you want to make. So it's like you went into the game, you made the game. Again, Sefton Hill, he still wrote the script. Like, people act like, oh, the people that made the Rocksteady games, they would have never written a story like this. Yes, they would. In fact, they did. People like Sweet Baby Inc. did not have them kill Batman. Like, Sweet Baby Inc. did not force Rocksteady to like have Harley Quinn shoot Batman in the face. That was all the original people that made the Arkham games. So I just want to say, I don't want to paint them as the villains. I don't want to paint them as villains, because at the end of the day, they made a bad game. It happens. Even the best directors make bad movies. But I just want to just say that at the end of the day, they are responsible for this game. They made this game. They wrote the story. As you saw there, Sefton Hill pivoted from having melee-based combat to gunplay. Like, he is ultimately responsible. And so him leaving the game early, it does feel a little scummy that you're just like leaving this game, you're just like abandoning ship, leaving this disaster onto your team, having them take the brunt of the criticism, leaving it so that, the vast majority of the fan base are now blaming these new people, acting like Sefton Hill and Jamie Walker are like these tortured artists. They're martyrs. You know what I mean? When that's just not true. As shitty as it is to admit, and believe me, I don't want to admit it, Rocksteady made a bad game. And it is what it is. In the fall of 2022, Warner Brothers... Oh, sorry. Where am I reading back? Okay. So that's the history of everything. Let's get into the future now. Despite the painful setback, Warner Brothers isn't giving up on video games. David Haddad, that's like one of the executives of Warner Brothers, David Haddad said that Warner Brothers Games was looking to do more collaboration between its dozen studios, and that the company was understaffed compared to competing publishers. So job cuts at Rocksteady wouldn't make sense. So that's interesting. So they're saying that, I'll be honest, I was fully expecting for layoffs, like, with how many layoffs there have been in the industry, I've been fully expecting for the day that that layoffs come from Rocksteady, and it would have been justified. I mean, listen, at the end of the day, like, if a studio underperforms, a studio underperforms. But it seems like that's not going to happen, which, I mean, hey, props to them, I guess. Many of the studio's employees are now helping to develop a new director's cut version of Hogwarts Legacy. At the same time, according to people familiar, the studio leaders are looking to pitch a new single-player game which would return Rocksteady to its roots. So, yeah, it seems like at the moment, Rocksteady is just kind of helping out. with working on like a director's cut of Hogwarts Legacy. I remember when I was first reading that, I was like, oh no, has Rocksteady been reduced to a support studio? I was like, oh no, that's crazy. But no, apparently they're working on pitching a new game. Which, listen, hope at the end of the day, while it is unfair to say that Suicide Squad was made by a different group of people and that the original games that worked at, or that the original developers that made the Batman Arkham games, it's like this is not their game. Like, that is unfair. What is fair to say is that at this point, Rocksteady is not the studio that they once were, right? The founders are gone. A bunch of the developers have left. This is a new group of talent. And maybe, and it is fair to say that Rocksteady is dead. This is a new studio. So at this point, in my eyes, they're an unproven commodity. I don't know whether or not to have faith that even if they make a single player game, that it's gonna be any good. I can hope. Maybe they'll attract some of the old talent. They're like, hey guys, we're making a new single player game. Come on back. I mean, maybe something like that happens. But what I will say though is that as far as what they should make, in my opinion, what they should make is a Batman Beyond game. I think that makes like the most sense, because I can understand not wanting, or I mean, like, I guess what would probably make the most financial sense is just make another fucking Batman Arkham game. Like, just do it. Like, who gives a fuck? But I can still understand, even at this point, past the disappointment of Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, that you don't just want to like regurgitate and do the same stuff that you've been doing. I think what you do is you make a Batman Arkham game. You make a Batman Beyond game. It's obviously going to be single player. You don't need to set it in the Arkhamverse. I don't know. I will say, the one thing that kind of bothers me about Batman Beyond is that I don't like the idea of knowing the future of like an ongoing universe. You know what I'm saying? Like that does kind of bug me. Unless you're just not going to do anything else in the Arkhamverse, which honestly is possible. So maybe you do make a Batman Beyond game set in the Arkhamverse. But either way, right? It's like it'll be fairly familiar, right? You bring back the free flow combat. You essentially you probably make it open world again, but the setting is going to be drastically different. The tone of it would probably be pretty different as well, although it should probably still be dark and gritty. But it'll have that like futuristic tone. I think you maybe even go for like a Blade Runner or 2099 kind of feel, right? You really make it a hardcore detective story, right? I think stuff like that could be super interesting. And make a game that feels familiar but fresh at the same time. I think that's what they should do. Some people will say it's like, oh, we'll just make a new IP. I don't think there's any chance in hell that they're making a new IP. I mean, I just don't think that Warner Brothers would let them at this point in time. I think they're going to want to make a game that at least has some IP like value. Especially because David Zaslav has talked about how he wants to mine their IPs even more. So, well, actually, I will say another thing that they could do is like, hey, I think that James Gunn, I think he has saying power when it comes to DC games, because he's talked about how there are going to be games that are set in his new DCU. Maybe Rocksteady finally makes their Superman game that everybody's been asking for. I mean, maybe they do that, and it's like it is the David Cornsweet Superman from Superman Legacy. Maybe they do something like that. That could also be interesting. So there are definitely a lot of possibilities about what could happen, but let me know what you think about this in the comments down below. Are you kind of like me, where you're kind of having to suck it up and admit that Rocksteady just made a bad game, that they're not necessarily victims here? I mean, they are victims to a certain extent, right? Because it like, maybe they weren't technically forced to make a live service game, but they were probably heavily suggested to do so. But at the end of the day, maybe Sefton Hill could have fought more and been like, hey, we don't know how to do this, guys. Like, make a new live service studio if you want a live service game. They probably could have done that as well. But like I said before, they also wanted to do at the very least a co-op game, which would have been different. Maybe not necessarily live service, but it would have been different. It would have been a co-op game. So Sefton Hill was already wanting to move away from what they did beforehand either way. So I just think we have to suck it up and accept that Rocksteady made a bad game. It is what it is. So let me know what you think about all that in the comments down below, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.